Hey everybody, this is Raul for Bass Musician Magazine, and today we have the great honor and pleasure of making the world a lot smaller via Skype with having a chance to chat with author Paul D. Boyer. How
Hi,
you
Raul. Thanks.
how you doing? For those of you that don't know, Paul is the author of the Rickenbacker Electric Bass, 50 years as rock's bottom. It's currently on its second edition. Hal Leonard is carrying this publication. We are so fortunate to be living during a time where our instrument is evolving and developing. The electric bass is a relatively new instrument compared to so many instruments, and we are witnessing history as it's happening. And there are many branches on this tree. Everybody always thinks about Leo Fender and kind of the main trunk of things, but there have been a group of people that have chosen to kind of veer off and make their own choices in their own direction and do it their own way. And so it's great that we have people like Paul that has been able to capture this information, consolidate it, and put it all in one place so that somebody who's considering maybe hanging on to that branch, if you will, they know kind of where to look. But let's take a step back, Paul. Tell us a little bit about your background with bass and how did you get interested in things bass?
Well, my family is kind of music oriented. My father was a very talented pianist, but he actually developed his talent without being able to read music. And he always played the swing era type music, swing era jazz, nothing bebop or anything like that. But he was really quite good at it. My mother was a singer, and this is just sort of avocations for them. They didn't do it professionally. But I think the genes kind of filtered down, and I kind of picked it up. I think when I started listening to music, our popular music, if you will, was probably 1962. So I was on board just before the Beatles started to come up through the ranks. And when I started hearing the Beatles and saw them on Ed Sullivan, and I got interested in the guitars and such, I picked up an uncle's acoustic guitar, and I like to listen to bass lines. For some reason, bass got into my ears better than anything else. And I just started thinking about harmonies, bass harmonies, and then tried to figure out the notes on a regular acoustic guitar using the lower two strings, the E and the A, and finding where those bass lines were and kind of thumping along on this little acoustic guitar. I didn't get a real bass guitar until I was in college. I was out in Los Angeles, and I wanted to get a Beatle bass. And I remember going into, I think it must have been the original or the precursor of Guitar Center in Hollywood, California, and actually getting my hands on a real Hofner bass, a real German-made Hofner bass, and just marveled at the thing because that's what Paul McCartney played, you know. But it was, in those days, I think it was close to $300, I think, in 1960, 68, 69.
Wow.
And I was just a kid in college and was like, I can't afford this. But I ended up finding in another music store, a piano store on Vermont Avenue in Los Angeles. And they sold a lot of pianos, but they also had some guitars. And they had a Japanese copy of the Hofner bass. And I looked at that and found out they only wanted $89 for it. So that I could afford. So I picked that up and started to practice bass lines with it, playing along to records, to the radio, whatever was available. And I ended up, just before I got out of college there, I went to LA City College for photography. That was my vocation at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up sitting in with a band up at near the UCLA campus in a place that was called the Pizza Palace, as I recall, in Westwood Village. And I sat in with a very talented singer James Lee Reeves, who kind of disappeared from the scene since then. And his guitarist behind him was a fella named Tom Wheeler. And if you know anything about guitar books and Guitar Player magazine, Tom Wheeler is quite the authority. And he was the other guitarist in the band, and I sat in on bass, and there was a fellow playing piano. So that was my first experience actually playing bass along with semi-professional musicians. Mm-hmm. And I'd always been interested in the bass lines and started thinking about getting into another band. I went into the Air Force for 4 years and never really played with anyone at that point. When I got out of the Air Force, I was in the Boston, Massachusetts area, and still had the Japanese copy of the Hofner, and started getting some friends who were interested in putting together a band. And I said, well, I can play bass and you can sing. Let's find a guitarist and drummer and so on. And we did. And we determined that we're going to have some better equipment. So I ended up buying a used Rickenbacker 4001 from the bass player of a very excellent lounge band, I guess you could call it, in the Boston area. Northeast Expressway was the name of the band. Excuse me. And he was selling off. He wanted to get a Gibson Ripper, so he sold off his Rickenbacker to me. And I knew nothing about the Rickenbacker at that point. I noticed that there was this little bitty humbucking pickup that was just floating in the treble pickup cavity. It wasn't attached to anything. It was just sitting there floating. It really wasn't the original equipment, but he apparently tried to replace the original pickup with this thing, and it was just laying there, and it wasn't working. So I ended up yanking it out, and I played with the toaster pickup for the rest of my time with the little band we put together. In 1977, I moved out to Colorado and got away from playing bass again and put my Rickenbacker underneath the guest bed. And there it sat until about 2002. Wow. And then I pulled it out. The company I worked for, Kalmbach Publishing Company out in Waukesha, Wisconsin, had a little throw-together band of people from the company. And they played at certain company events like the profit sharing party or Christmas party or whatever. And they were looking for a bass player. And I said, well, I could probably play bass. So I pulled the Rickenbacker out from underneath the guest bed and got it tuned up and ended up taking it into a shop in the Milwaukee area and had them actually put the right pickup in, do a tune-up, getting everything right. And then ended up playing with that band. Around the same time, I started thinking more about this Rickenbacker bass, and the internet was coming up real big at that time, and I thought, well, maybe I can find out more. So I started doing searches and stumbled upon the Rick Resource forums, and there was a lot of discussions within that forum about the Rick basses. They had an entire department on just Rick basses. And a lot of information was changing hands back and forth. Well, things were this way and things were that way. And if you have one from this year, you have this feature and so on. And I started kind of mentally jotting all of this down and realized that there was a lot of conflicting information. It wasn't consistent. Well, this guy said this and this guy said that, and they're both adamant about this as being the facts. So I started thinking, somebody should write all this down, put it into a book. Yeah. And so I started gathering information, started making friends on the internet, on the forum groups. And I think my first buddy from the forum was Jeff Rath, who's known on many now as Rick 5, I think he calls himself. He has a little business where he will take a Rickenbacker 4-string and convert it into a 5-string, and he does a great job. Anyway, he and I made friends, and we got together with another buddy of his, and on a visit that I dropped off a couple basses, sold him one bass, had him modify my two other basses at the time. And we ended up calling this little party when we got together. We had 20 Rick basses all in the same room, and we took photos of it, and we got on the forums and we called it, this is the Rickenbacker Confluence. Yeah. And that ended up catching fire, and then other people started putting together little get-togethers of Rickenbacker collectors and owners and players. And Jeff Scott from Cleveland and a couple of other guys ended up putting together the first official Rickenbacker, not Rickenbacker sponsored, but at least Rickenbacker Confluence in Columbus, Ohio. And that was, I think, in 2005, I believe. And then that's when I started photographing every Rick bass I could get my hands on in the process of putting together some sort of reference material, either book form or online or something, where it straightened everything out, all this conflicting information. So that was the start of it. I ended up retiring from my job at Comblock Publishing in 2006, and said that, well, I'm going to do my retirement project. I'm going to make this book. Mm-hmm. So I started to develop the ideas of the book, and I had lots of thinking about it and what I'm going to say, and I wrote some manuscript, had a bunch of photos, and then one day I said, well, I'm going to start making the book. So I started just putting the pages together in a consumer level page making program called Pages in iWork, which is on the Macintosh. Mm-hmm. And you can really do wonderful things with that. But you can't do like a spread, which is 2 pages where you spread something across the page. You can only go 1 page at a time, at least as far as I could discover with that program. Then I started making it, and then I thought, well, I could self-publish this, with Lulu and these other self-publishing software and services. And thought, well, I wonder about doing it in the professional realm. And so I ended up calling Hal Leonard Publishing. And in my mind, before I called them, I was thinking, well, there's some big-ass New York publisher who's probably not going to want to talk to me. And I went to their website and discovered that their offices are right here in Milwaukee.
Oh, wow.
So I just called them up and said, is there anybody from product development I can talk to about a book? I connected me with Brad Smith and talked with him, and he said, well, I think you're going to have to get what they call the complete buy-in of Rickenbacker, the company, as far as aiding me putting this book together. I kind of figured that wasn't going to work out because Rickenbacker, as most people know, is a privately held company, family owned. John Hall and his son, Ben Hall, and Cindy are the officers of the organization, and they're busy making bases. They were like 2 years behind in orders, trying to struggle getting all that stuff done. And they really couldn't give me much help at all, really. They offered to send me some photographs, but only if they could get a hold of them easily, and the stuff that I was really looking for. They said, well, we probably have that around here somewhere, but we probably won't be able to look for it anytime soon. So all these indefinites coming from them, I thought, well, phooey, I'll just proceed with the photographs I've taken at the guitar shows and getting photos from other collectors and players, and started building the book. So this went on for a couple of years, and still figuring I'm going to self-publish it rather than get Hal Leonard to do it because they wanted to get the company buy-in. Mm-hmm. So I ended up doing about 2/3 of the book the way I wanted to, as far as every chapter is about one particular model and what the features are, that kind of stuff. So I ended up putting about 2/3 of the book together, and then I put it into color printouts and into clear sleeves and a loose leaf binder, and I went back to Hal Leonard. And I said, would you be interested in publishing this book now? And I showed it to them, and they said, "Wow, this is great. Yes, we can, but you're going to have to put it into InDesign, which is a different software for bookmakers."
Yeah.
And I had some experience with InDesign at my regular profession as a magazine editor, and so I knew what I had to do. The problem was you couldn't just pour pages from pages into InDesign. There was no way to translate it. So what I ended up doing was using the pages layouts and just duplicating them myself, just taking all the pieces and putting them back on the page in InDesign. And then I could also use the spread situation where I could put the illustrations across the page and throw things out the edges of the borders and bleed out and so on. And then slowly built the book that way. And the original book was given to them in late February of 2013. And the book was 100. I better check. I've got one right here. Here's the original copy. This is what I call the blue one, the first edition. Mm-hmm. And it's 144 pages, the original one. And that came out in July of 2013. And it's sold well. I wouldn't say like hotcakes, but any book, as you probably know, with in your magazine publishing, everything happens real quick at first, and then it slows down. So it sold rapidly at first, and then it tapers off, and that's the way it is. They came to me at the end of October last year and said, "It looks like your edition is going to sell out finally." I think it was a press run of only 4,000, but that's the way the book world works. Mm-hmm. And they said, "Do you want to do any corrections for a second printing?" And I said, "Well, I do have corrections. There were some typos, some misstatements, some things that got cleared up subsequently after the publication." And I said, "But I've got more information. I've got better photos, more photos, and there's been new models introduced by Rickenbacker that we can cover, and we could make a second edition rather than a second printing." So they came back to me and said, "Well, a second edition is going to sell better than a second printing, and when can you get it to us?" So I ended up, okay, probably in March. So I got it to them in early March of this year, 2017, and the second edition came out in July. So that's where we are, and it's doing okay.
The whole process of publishing a book, and especially one that has a particular target audience, because you start kind of whittling down. You go, okay, well, musicians, not all musicians would be interested, so it's going to be bass players. And you go, but not all bass players are going to be interested. And you narrow it down to Rickenbacker fans. And when you put into account some of the mere challenges of even seeing a Rickenbacker, and it has to do with them, they are doing things exactly the way they want to do them. And, there's nothing wrong with that, power to them. But when your production is behind by a few years, where they do color runs all in one batch. So if you wanted a particular color, and that one hasn't run for months, so if you wanted fire glow and they're doing sea green, you're just going to wait all that much longer.
I wish I'd see green again.
Yeah.
Love that color.
And so it's kind of, it narrows the funnel down, and it kind of puts it in the hands of individuals that just by sheer fortune, like yourself, end up with a Rickenbacker in their hand, and that they like the characteristics of it, because that's a whole other thing too. There's the issues of how the shape is, the way they were working the pickups at the time with the toaster and the humbucker. Other people might look at it and go, "Oh, no, I just want a precision bass kind of, I just want a single pickup. I don't want to do this," or "This is in my way. That whole toaster pickup with the cover and things on it, some people might go, I don't like that. I don't want that.
Yeah. Well, the toaster is usually in the bass position. I think you're thinking about the horseshoe,
Yes, the
uh,
horseshoe. Yes.
which was not a humbucker actually. The horseshoe pickup is an acquired acquired taste. Originally, that was the pickup that they had on their bass. The
Hmm.
original pickup, original bass was developed in the mid '50s, came out and started marketing it in 1957, and it had just a single horseshoe pickup, and it was rather slavish, very heavy body. And it was just kind of made with pieces that they could find that would work for the bridge, the knobs, everything kind of came from the guitar land onto the bass. So it was sort of a Frankenstein kind of approach. Then they started refining it, and the horseshoe pickup eventually was replaced in the late '60s with a high gain pickup, but they kept the same design as far as mounting the pickup in a large cavity. And instead of having the actual horseshoes laying over the pickup, the high gain didn't have that. It had magnetic slugs, if you will.
Hmm.
And so that cover, the horseshoe, was no longer necessary. However, they wanted to kind of keep the same look going, and people, quite a few people, like to use that horseshoe shape as a hand rest if they're picking or using thumb or even fingers.
Hmm.
Like to use that cover as a hand rest. So they ended up developing it just a plastic replacement for the original horseshoe that just covers up the pickup, serves as a hand rest. But a lot of people don't like that. It's their sweet spot where they want to pick or pluck. So they end up taking that cover off, and that's fine. Yeah,
Well, and it goes back to the other characteristic is that I think one of the big draws of any brand of bass has been the comfort level in the hands of the individual, and secondarily the sound. And you've had people that have been willing to adapt because Paul McCartney is a great example of a Rickenbacker player, but he's left-handed.
mm-hmm.
And so we start narrowing down the field. Left-handed Ricks are even less than, than the rest of them.
As far as numerically, you mean? Yeah,
Oh yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And so it's really just kind of almost a fortuitous circumstance that could have this in the hand. And I think the visibility, it might get people's attention. Somebody sees Chris Squire playing, uh, and they're going, "Oh, I gotta check out one of those basses." And try as they will, you can't wander into Guitar Center and just find one. Probably,
Yeah.
so it's kind of like, okay, this is I don't know how I'll ever get a chance to see them. Fortunately for us, when we go to the NAMM show, we get to see all the lovely Rickenbackers hanging up, and you go,
Sure.
okay, there's a whole bunch of them, but out in the real world, they're a lot more scarce. So I find one of the things that I really enjoyed with the way you've designed your book, of course, it's a chronological development, so people can see how things kind of progressed. Rickenbacker is one of those brands that they didn't make a lot of dramatic changes. There are other brands, I'll use Gibson as an example, who kind of tried some and I'm avoiding using the word extreme, but very different
Sure.
approaches to things. And I guess if the saying nothing tried, nothing gained, well, there were some things that Gibson did that didn't work out so great. And then they learned and they moved on, and now you don't see that particular instrument anymore. Whereas
Sure.
with Rickenbacker, there was not an awful lot. I mean, the variety is kind of they stayed very true to their form. They're subtle differences, whether it's the fret markers or whether it's the piping around the edge, but the general shape and the headstock stayed the same for a lot. When they ventured into the ones that had more of an acoustic cavity, those had their own kind of shape and they stayed very much kind of the same. And there is even, and I'll point out one of my favorite things in your book, there's a wall chart. It folds out, and it reminds me kind of the genealogical development when you see like them charting how mankind has progressed. There you go. Exactly what I'm talking about. It looks like a family tree
Yes.
in the genealogical development. And when you look at it, you go, okay, there's a lot of things that they've tried and they liked and they stayed with, and they've continued that. But this is a great resource, especially when you look at the fact that these things aren't necessarily readily available for the general public. And so anybody who is even remotely thinking, maybe I like the way Chris Squire sounds, or I liked the way that Paul McCartney sounds, then they might look into it. And one of the differences, like with Paul McCartney and the Hofner has a symmetrical shape, so you can flip it over and make it left-handed at will. So that's kind of the no-brainer when it comes to left-handed instruments, right?
Sure.
But
Yeah.
with the Ricks, and I'll even jump back with the Gibsons. They have a great following. They have a huge following, but it's also, even having spoken with the author of the Gibson book, it's kind of a love or hate kind of thing. Either you get it in your hands and you just love it to death, in spite of its peculiarities. And I say that kind of like people, because we are flawed in our nature, and hopefully there's somebody, all of us will have something that somebody goes, I like Paul in spite of fill in the blank. And the same is true with these instruments, is that with the Gibsons, some of the even discontinued models, there's people that just love those particular ones, and that was the one they liked. And with
Sure.
with Rickenbackers, did you find in your research, obviously there is there kind of the strengths for the love and hate argument of this instrument? What do you feel were the strongest points, and what are the probably not so, and I don't want to even call them flaws, because they haven't even changed them, so I don't think they see them as flaws, but ups
Well,
and downs.
they're idiosyncrasies, let's say.
Sure.
And there are certain ways that they have done things that some people just can't adapt to, love or hate. They don't feel comfortable with them.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people who are used to the shape of the Fender P bass or J bass, they get a hold of a Rickenbacker and they feel as though the neck feels funny because it tapers so little compared to the way the neck of a jazz bass, which is very narrow at the top and gets wider as you get toward the bottom, or toward the body. By contrast, the Rickenbacker's taper is very gradual in that respect. The position of the pickups, like again, we have that problem with the horseshoe thing getting in the way. Some people object to the weight, although they're probably not any heavier or perhaps a little bit lighter than a J bass or a P bass. You find some people that adapt to them immediately. When I was telling you about when I went from this Japanese Hofner clone,
Mm-hmm.
which was neck heavy compared to a regular Hofner, but the Hofner is the actual Hofner is very light. It's less than 5 pounds. The Beetle bass.
Wow.
It's like an eggshell. It seems like a toy when you play it, and it has a short scale, and it has very smooth wound strings on it. And when I went from that one to the Rickenbacker 4001 that I bought used, it had rotor sounds on it, because that was what everybody was playing, because that's what was on Chris Squire's bass.
Mm-hmm.
And the round wound, you get that grind, it's just wonderful sound. But boy, was it a challenge with my young 25-year-old fingers at the time, trying to adapt from a short scale to a long scale, from smooth wound to round wound, to a different shaped neck, to a much heavier bass. It was quite an adjustment period. But some people find they can adapt to it, and once they've had it long enough, that's normal. So then a P bass or a J bass or a Gibson or a limbic or something else is going to feel funny to them.
Sure.
So anybody that is thinking about getting a Rickenbacker bass, they should be aware that there may be an adjustment period because it does sound so different or feel so different. Things are in different positions for you, and it's just a matter of playing it long enough and you get used to it and everything's fine after that. And Rickenbacker didn't always just sit on that one particular model, although it seems like it's that way. But they did the 4005, the hollow body series. It's neck-wise, it's very similar to the 4001 series, but the body was quite a bit different. Then in the I want to say the late 70s to early 80s, they started coming up with an alternate bass, and that was the 3000, which was a short scale, and the 3001, which is a long scale. Mm-hmm. But completely different body shape, completely different controls. One pickup, so it was sort of a budget-minded bass, if you will.
Gotcha.
And it was quite different looking, and people, when they see it in the public or some band is playing it, they look at, what is that? That's a Rickenbacker? No, that can't be a Rickenbacker. But sure enough, it was. And the 3000 series developed into the 2000 series. By the way, Rickenbacker's numbering system, I have no understanding of why they called things. But they came up with the 2000 series after the 3000 series. And before and long after the 4000 series. So yeah, but the 2020 and the 2050 were the first 2000 series basses, and then those had what some people confused to being a active circuitry, but it was not. It was a solid state board that had the connection for the output jack, and then minimal wiring to get to the pickups and controls. But most everything was put onto a little circuit board, and that was the thing to do back in the early 90s.
Sure.
Apparently that didn't work out so well for them, and they ended up developing those further into the 2030 and 2060. Now you say, why didn't they make the 2020 and the 2040 2060? But no, it was apparently a 40 designation in Rickenbacker's mind is, if you put 40 in there, you put the 4 in there, people are going to think you have 3 pickups.
Yeah.
It's got something to do with the way they've made their model numbers for the guitar, so it gets a little confusing. But anyway, the later versions of the 2000 series were wired up very similarly to the new 4004 editions that were coming out, the Cheyenne and Laredo. And so they had the same control layout as the 4004 series.
Got you. Well, this illustrates one of the key points and one of the reasons I think this is a great book, and that is in order to know the players, especially with a nomenclature like there is with all of the numeric system not necessarily following ascending order, this is like the playbook so you can further understand it. And I'm glad that you found it confusing too, because as I was going through it, I started kind of glazing over, going, "There's all I don't get the rhyme or reason behind the numeric system," and it's like even with Air Force aircraft, an F-14, F-15, F-16. They kind of followed each other. They didn't start going backwards. Like, here, we've had F-15s. Let's make some F-10s. Or something like, there's an evolution and the numbers get higher. But this is great greatly helpful to kind of grasp and to differentiate and capture the subtleties. So
Mhm.
for people that are Rickenbacker owners and they actually have got their hands on one and they've got used to playing it, this is a great resource to be able to know all about your own instrument. And I think the people that are building the instruments are too busy to tell you about this. So somebody like Paul has to take time to compile all of this information and put it in place so you can get to know your instrument. Back in the day, uh, we owned an MGB, a 66 MGB, and we had to get a book that somebody wrote about it just to understand half of the things about the vehicle because the people, the Brits that were building them were too busy to tell us everything there was to know. And it wasn't until we did that we started discovering subtleties like the shock absorbers require replenishing a fluid. It has a hydraulic thing that you need to do. And you're like, oh, gee, I never knew that. So Rickenbacker owners definitely need to have this book. It should be on their bookshelf. And of course, the second edition is the one to get because there's more information and updates and things and that. But in addition, just all of us bass players, in order to know more about this particular branch of the family tree, it was a great read. It's very colorful. The photographs are great.
Thank you.
Even seeing the color, like in their choices and finishes, which is kind of interesting because we know so many people know that Fender has used a lot of the automobile industry colors with their paint patterns and things, and Rickenbacker kind of went with their own how they're doing this, the fire glow. I mean, it's just really cool to see this illustrated and organized and put together in a very easy to understand. And if let's say you know a Rickenbacker player, this is a great gift. This would be the kind of thing going, this is quite relevant. So, Paul, thank you so much for taking time and to begin with writing a book of this nature, because this kind of historical document is important to both the Rickenbacker players and bassists in general, but also for chatting with us and telling us about the whole process and the whole evolution of this. Looking forward, I know this is one project. Do you have any other bass related projects that you're looking at working on in the future?
No. I've only known Rickenbackers, though I've touched other instruments. I really don't know enough about them, and don't my interests don't go in other directions on that. So, if someone wanted to come to me and say, "Why don't you do a book on alembic basses or uh, Jeepers, or Dan Armstrong basses, or
Sure.
something like that," I'd say, "Well, sorry, I had thought about doing something on Hofner basses, but then a couple fellows came out with their more recent Hofner book, which is a beautiful, beautiful piece. So it's no, no. I'm just this is my one effort in the music business because it's something I've been able to study and add years of experience with. But for me to start looking at another bass line and do a book on it, no, no. Just doing this book is in its field guide format, if you will. It's really my main effort to try to get the information on Rickenbacker basses settled down into something that's easily accessible for people to get the right information on which basses, which model is this, what color is that.
Totally.
And how to distinguish them from fakers. Although I don't have a chapter on fakers in the book, at least you get enough photos of real ones, and after a while you realize what you're looking at when you see one that's a little questionable. And so, no, that's not a Rick. I've never seen one like that in Paul's book.
There you go. Well, again, we appreciate you taking time to put together something that's monumental work. And again, it's important that somebody that has the knowledge is able to put it all together and share it with the rest of us. So, folks, if you're looking for the Rickenbacker Electric Bass, 50 years as rock's bottom, certainly you can find it. There it is. I got mine too, so we're all good with that. You can find it easily on Amazon.com, and we'll make sure we include the link so that people can find it firsthand and check it out for themselves. So, Paul, thank you for taking time to chat with us, people. You've seen it here. Paul D. Boyer, the Rickenbacker Electric Bass book, coming to you live on Bass Musician Magazine.
Thanks for bassing out with us here on BassMusicianMagazine.com.